Hello, over here. This is the final part of a three-stage series of podcasts relating to the transatlantic slave trade and discussions around reparations. The title for this section, part 3, is Global Reparations Movement, Strength in Numbers. The last two podcasts explored different perspectives of the topic of various countries who were involved in the slave trade of history, with all the suffering and inhumane treatment of certain groups of society that took place, and was very much part of the fabric of those nations. Reparations for the countries and its people who suffered in the clutches of this vile process has long since been an issue for those countries who suffered economically and who were made to continue suffering for years afterwards, whilst those nations who were responsible for the cruelty to people and the pillaging of artefacts and resources from those poorer nations continued to become rich in resources that did not belong to them in the first place. In the first podcast, we looked at reparations and how the excuses, words, phrases, whatever you want to call it, of sorrow or regret or both are not enough. That is not a response that is of any use. We looked at definitions of reparations, and the general summary of the dictionary definition came down to this: the payment of damages, indemnification. We discussed the transatlantic slavery trade and the role of the UK and the port and city of Bristol. What was Britain's role? Who was involved? What was bought and sold? Who stopped it? And what is the effect of the trade today? We explored the slavery routes from Bristol to Africa. Bristol developed into one of the major trading ports in Britain from at least the 14th century. Bristol was the second English city after London. Then we looked at from Africa to America. Many British ships made the journey to West Africa to trade for enslaved African people. Once on board, the enslaved Africans would be taken across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, where they would be sold to the plantation owners who needed them to work on the plantations there. The ships would then load up with new cargo for the last leg of the journey back to Britain. We looked at, in that first podcast, the journey, the history, the records that we could find, and obviously many researchers, and that's why there are lots of links at the end of each of the articles, from America to Bristol. The last leg of the triangular trade was the return back to Bristol. This is known as the return passage. The slave ships would have left Bristol many months before for West Africa. I talked about the places involved. Africa. Africa was the source for the millions of slaves shipped across the Atlantic Ocean between the 15th and the 19th centuries. It was also the source for slaves who were shipped north and east to the Arab world from the 7th century. Europeans rarely went further into Africa than the coastal areas. Before the Europeans even knew of Africa, it was a rich and varied continent with many different cultures and civilizations. Art, culture and technology. West African craftspeople produced a wide range of sophisticated items, brass objects were made by the Brass Workers Guild in the city of Benin, part of what is today Nigeria. Guilds were professional bodies set up for different craftspeople. Europe. Many port towns and cities around Europe joined in the transatlantic slave trade. The slave trade was dominated by three main players: France, Britain, and Portugal, were the major slave trading nations. Spain was a major user of slave labour in its Caribbean and South American colonies. The West Indies. From 1492, the islands and the east coast of mainland America were settled by Europeans. They were farming the land, growing crops at first for food, then later for luxury crops to be sold. On the islands, the local people were made to work the land by the invading Europeans. In 1639, there were 1,000 Africans on the Caribbean island of Barbados. You may recall that there was quite a large section on Barbados in the second podcast in this series, and there are a number of links to various websites relating to Barbados and the history of the slave trade. South Americas. When people talk or write about the transatlantic slave trade, they usually concentrate on what happened in the Caribbean and North America. Usually Central and South America are not included in the story, even though they were involved. Europeans colonized what are known as the Americas. The continent includes the Caribbean, Canada, the USA, and the Central and South American countries such as Mexico and Brazil. A mixture of English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese people travelled across the Atlantic Ocean to settle in many parts of the Americas. The East Indies. After arriving in Africa, the Americas, and Asia, European powers wanted to own or colonize them. These new continents offered wealth and power to the European countries. Vast areas of the world were divided up and fought over by the Europeans. Britain owned parts of America and the Caribbean and had strong links with numerous places in Africa and Asia. And as mentioned earlier on, it was listed again in this section to, I no doubt, highlight the importance that Bristol played in bringing in trade to Britain beyond Bristol, around Britain itself. Bristol, at the beginning of the 18th century, was the second most important port in the country after London, and the third largest city. In case you're wondering why I'm sort of quickly going over and naming these areas, this is to reinforce the theme of this part 3 of the series about it not being slavery and what went on with slavery in the transatlantic routes and ports that they pillaged and committed genocide, basically. The point of this, part 3, is to say that it is a global problem. It is a global responsibility to fix. It is not about, or rather it is less effective to concentrate or leave individual countries and groups that have been formed to argue and try and persuade their government of that day to do something about it. It does happen. I'm not saying that it will not produce results. And trust me, from the limited time I've had to research this. There's a vast amount of information out there. That's just why I've included so many links in this final part for people to at least start their journey on it, and you'll see what I mean. There is lots and lots of information out there now, and more is being added every day. But it's almost like, and I've put it in the article, I remember putting it so I know that it's there somewhere towards the end, where I've likened it a little bit to when you have an employee who is concerned about their working conditions in whatever form, and they raise it with their manager or their HR team or whoever within that particular organisation. It's that one person trying to hopefully persuade them to improve their working conditions. So you have the single person or individuals going separately to the management of that organisation, pleading for better conditions. And then if you look at it in terms of if there was a national body, group, organisation, trade union, whatever you want to call it, but they represent all workers in that field across the board in the country and also contribute to, on occasion, depending on what the workers' rights are, global discussions on topics. You become stronger, strength in numbers. Which is why I added that strength in numbers phrase in the title of this section of the series. The debate about reparation has conveniently been branded extreme and unrealistic by those who don't want to pay. We happily listen to the heir to the throne. Well, I didn't happily listen because I just don't listen to them full stop, but there are people out there that do, who on Windrush Day said Britain owed a debt of gratitude to the people of the Caribbean, while ignoring the reality that what Britain owes is in fact a straight-up financial debt. In the Caribbean, Britain received, in the words of Nobel Prize-winning economist Arthur Lewis, 200 years of free labour from over 15 million black people and those who were indentured from India. In this final part of this series, we will look at the global movement approach to seeking reparation. It is a growing movement, and from my brief foray into this subject, a global approach seems to be stronger than the likelihood of success being and the likelihood of success being higher, I think. So it's just my personal opinion. You'll arrive at different ones or maybe the same when you've done some research as well. So I came to the conclusion, I had no thoughts on it before I started this, but I did finish my research for these 3 podcasts believing that a global movement was a much better proposition and stood more chances of success. We'll see. The alternative is to corral the individual groups seeking reparation to the whim and control of the governing bodies in each of their respective countries, as I said a couple of minutes ago. The UK is, I am sure, replicating the standard classic responses it gives to such matters. Express regret and contort their expression into one that is meant to replicate interest and sorrow, and then the aristocrat concerned returns to their homes and businesses that many of them acquired on the backs of slaves. How slavery helped build a world economy. The slavery system in the United States was a national system that touched the very core of its economic and political life. African people were captured and transported to the Americas to work. Most European colonial economies in the Americas from the 16th through to the 19th century were dependent on enslaved African labour for their survival. According to European colonial officials, the abundant land that they had discovered in the Americas was useless without sufficient labour to exploit it. Slavery systems of labour exploitation were preferred, but neither European nor Native American sources proved adequate to the task. Of the 6.5 million immigrants who survived the crossing of the Atlantic and settled in the Western Hemisphere between 1492 and 1776, only 1 million were European. The remaining 5.5 million were African. So much more information on how the world benefited from slavery, some of which is contained in the links at the end of the article that accompanies this podcast. I have included the links from parts 1 and 2 as well. This leads into this section quite well in terms of individual nations arguing, pleading their case to their respective governments, or a global movement for global requests for reparation, as the world benefited in a variety of ways economically, not just the nations mentioned in this series. Not only plantation owners, but a whole chain of people who developed trades and industries that developed really on the back of the vessels travelling the seas and the various landing points where plantations were developed, etc. Coercion and forced assimilation often accompanied these gains, and scholars still debate colonialism has many legacies. Colonialism impacts include environmental degradation, the spread of disease, economic instability, ethnic rivalries, and human rights violations, issues that can long outlast one group's colonial rule. How should reparations be defined? It is argued by some professionals and researchers that reparations should not only be defined in terms of financial compensation, but should additionally include various types of systemic change that focus on physical and psychological harms. While reparation advocacy has been around in one form or another for more than a century, the newer, more global movement comes as an era of globalization has helped bring once disjointed parts of the African diaspora into a more universal fight for reparations for the descendants of enslaved people. The case for British slavery reparation can no longer be ignored. This next section is on an organisation called CARICOM, who I have to say I only I'd heard of the name, but I didn't know much about it. But in the recent weeks doing research for this, I am amazed that I didn't know more about it, but I certainly do now. CARICOM. There are many links to the main website, but a number of spin-off websites still connected with CARICOM that I've listed at the end of the article. Each one of them so good. There are a couple of parts within the website where two links did work before and they're not working now. As of recording this, I did check. I will check again before I put the article on the website on Monday. But apart from those two links, everything else worked fine. And I would say very, very high quality information. A lot of good work going on, a lot of partnership working, a lot of research being undertaken, data being gathered. Very, very organised, very impressive. I also discovered that there are at least 10 different CARICOM Twitter accounts, all related to the main website, but this is to show you how each of the teams is very, very active on a number of platforms. Again, I was impressed. And I have put those at the end of the article, at least most of them. I will make sure that I've got all of them there before I publish. But yeah, very, very impressive. CARICOM is the oldest surviving integration movement in the developing world. It is a grouping of 20 countries, 15 member states, and 5 associate members. Its mandate is to promote and support a unified Caribbean community that is inclusive, resilient, competitive, sharing in economic, social, and cultural prosperity. There is the full text of a presentation that was delivered in September 2020, looking at global models of seeking reparation as opposed to individual groups and organisations to try and make a case relative to their own country. Reparation discussions, if they ever got that far, would be between the government of the day and entities set up to continue to argue their case with their government in power. If any deal was ever reached in the future, it would be between those two groups in respect of a particular country. The potential for types and amounts of reparation could vary enormously, dependent upon the country and its citizens. The Global Reparation Movement is advocating in a very different way. It looks at slavery as being a world issue, not just an issue for where slaves were placed. It is regarded as a world issue because the world benefited from slavery in some way, whether or not they had slaves working in their countries. It has been said many times already, in the limited research that I could do for this topic, that if the same atrocities occurred today, it would be classed as genocide and a serious breach in human rights on a global scale. This movement and its linked groups, like CARICOM, believe that there is more chance of a breakthrough by using a global approach, not placing the responsibility solely on individual countries and their governments. International Human Rights Act applies across the board to all countries who sign up to it, and for those who have not, the fact that an international forum exists is still a plus for everyone. In the presentation mentioned earlier, it highlights a 10-point plan, a structure relating to the factors which would be integral to universal coverage, and debates around universal payouts of reparation. There is also a video of that presentation, and I have put the link in the article. The presentation was entitled Broadening the Dialogue on Reparation in the Global Context. The presentation was delivered by Earl Buckay, Chairman of the St. Lucia National Reparations Committee, NRC for short, and member of CARICOM Reparations Commission, CRC for short. The venue for this presentation and its audience was Yale University. An acronym that you will see on a number of the websites connected with CARICOM or the global movement, and that is the Organisation of Eastern Caribbean States, OECS. I'm going to do a quick summary through this 10-point plan, the 10 sections basically. Number 1, full formal apology. The healing process for victims and the descendants of the enslaved and enslavers requires as a precondition the offer of a sincere formal apology by the governments of Europe. Some governments, in refusing to offer an apology, have issued in place statements of regrets. Such statements do not acknowledge that crimes have been committed and represent a refusal to take responsibility for such crimes. Statements of regrets represent, furthermore, a reprehensible response to the call for apology, in that they suggest that victims and their descendants are not worthy of an apology. Only an explicit, formal apology will suffice within the context of this plan. Second section, repatriation. Over 10 million Africans were stolen from their homes and forcefully transported to the Caribbean as the enslaved chattel and property of Europeans. The transatlantic slave trade is the largest forced migration in human history and has no parallel in terms of man's inhumanity to man. This trade in enchained bodies was a highly successful commercial business for the nations of Europe. The lives of millions of men, women and children were destroyed in search of profit. The descendants of these stolen people have a legal right to return to their homeland. A repatriation program must be established and all available channels of international law and diplomacy used to resettle those persons who wish to return. A resettlement program should address such matters as citizenship and deploy available best practices in respect of community reintegration. Number 3. Indigenous Peoples Development Program. The governments of Europe committed genocide upon the native Caribbean population. Military commanders were given official instructions by their governments to eliminate these communities and to remove those who survive from the region. Genocide and land appropriation went hand in hand. A community of over 3 million in 1700 has been reduced to less than 30,000 in 2000. Survivors remain traumatized, landless, and are the most marginalized social group within the region. The University of the West Indies offers an Indigenous Peoples Scholarship in a desperate effort at rehabilitation. It is woefully insufficient. A development plan is required to rehabilitate this community. Number 4. Cultural institutions. European nations have invested in the development of community institutions such as museums and research centres in order to prepare their citizens for an understanding of these. These facilities serve to reinforce within the consciousness of their citizens an understanding of their role in history as rulers and change agents. There are no such institutions in the Caribbean. Caribbean school teachers and researchers do not have the same opportunity. Number 5. Public health crisis. The African descended population in the Caribbean has the highest incidence in the world of chronic diseases in the forms of hypertension and type 2 diabetes. This pandemic is the direct result of the nutritional experience, physical and emotional brutality, and overall stress profiles associated with slavery, genocide and apartheid. Over 10 million Africans were imported into the Caribbean during the 400 years of slavery. At the end of slavery in the late 19th century, less than 2 million remained. The chronic health conditions of Caribbean blacks now constitutes the greatest financial risk to sustainability in the region. Arresting this pandemic requires the injection of science, technology, and capital beyond the capacity of the region. Europe has a responsibility to participate in the alleviation of this health disaster, and calls upon the governments of Europe to take responsibility for this tragic human legacy of slavery and colonisation. Number 6. Illiteracy eradication. At the end of the European colonial period in most parts of the Caribbean, the British in particular left the black and indigenous communities in a general state of illiteracy. Some 70% of blacks in British colonies were functionally illiterate in the 1960s when nation-states began to appear. Jamaica, the largest such community, was home to the largest number of citizens. Widespread illiteracy has subverted the development efforts of these nation-states and represents a drag upon social and economic advancement. Caribbean governments allocate more than 70% of public expenditure to health and education in an effort to uproot the legacies of slavery and colonisation. European governments have a responsibility to participate in this effort. Number 7. African Knowledge Programme. The forced separation of Africans from their homeland has resulted in cultural and social alienation from identity and existential belonging. I'm unable to speak today. Denied the right in law to life, and divorced by space from the source of historic self. Africans have craved the right to return and knowledge of the root to roots. A programme of action is required to build bridges of belonging. Such projects as school exchanges and culture tours, community artistic and performance programmes, entrepreneurial and religious engagements, as well as political interaction, are required in order to neutralise the void created by slave voyages. Such actions will serve to build knowledge networks that are necessary for community rehabilitation. Number 8. Psychological rehabilitation. For over 400 years, Africans and their descendants were classified in law as non-human, chattel, property and real estate. They were denied recognition as members of the human family bylaws derived from the parliaments and palaces of Europe. This history has inflicted massive psychological trauma upon African descendant populations. This much is evident daily in the Caribbean. Only a reparatory justice approach to truth and educational exposure can begin the process of healing and repair. Such an engagement will call into being, for example, the need for greater Caribbean integration designed to enable the coming together of the fragmented community. Number 9. Technology transfer. For 400 years, the trade and production policies of Europe could be summed up in the British slogan, "Not a nail is to be made in the colonies." The Caribbean was denied participation in Europe's industrialisation process and was confined to the role of producer and exporter of raw materials. This system was designed to extract maximum value from the region and to enable maximum wealth accumulation in Europe. The effectiveness of this policy meant that the Caribbean entered its nation-building phase as a technologically and scientifically ill-equipped backward space within the postmodern world economy. Generations of Caribbean youth, as a consequence, have been denied membership and access to the science and technology culture that is the world's youth's patrimony. Technology transfer and science sharing for development must be part of the new approach. And finally, number 10, debt cancellation. Caribbean governments that emerged from slavery and colonialism have inherited the massive crisis of community poverty and institutional unpreparedness for development. These governments still daily engage in the business of cleaning up the colonial mess in order to prepare for development. The pressure of development has driven governments to carry the burden of public employment and social policies designed to confront colonial legacies. This process has resulted in states accumulating unsustainable levels of public debt that now constitute their fiscal entrapment. This debt cycle property belongs to the imperial governments, who have made no sustained attempt to deal with debilitating colonial legacies. Support for the payment of domestic debt and cancellation of international debt are necessary reparatory actions. I hope I sparked your interest in the global approach, and hopefully from the links you will discover a number of new organisations that are doing work quietly behind the scenes, and no doubt as they join forces will become much higher profile. That's the end of this 3-part series on the transatlantic slave trade and the continuing ripple effects and outcomes from that process. And I hope that the podcast today has given you some thoughts whether or not you agree with that 10-point plan. I look at it as being, at least it's a start, it's something, it's a framework with which to build and to change, and as things are reviewed, go through it that way. But I quite like the approach that it's not just, even if we got as far as any of the people who've benefited from the slave trade, even if countries were to just hand over money, that wouldn't do it. So I was quite impressed with that 10-point plan. I like the approaches and the themes that they've got within it. And I have no doubt, as I said, it will change and evolve as time goes by. I apologise for the number of links. It is at least 2 pages of A4, and I could have done more than double that. But I wanted to give you a starting point for any questions or thoughts that you might have on any of the 3 podcasts on this series, and I will do a follow-up one later on in the year. So hopefully you found that interesting. As usual, I look forward to your comments, and I look forward to the podcast next Sunday, which is all about the psychology of resentment, and I will be looking at the psychological approach, if you like, research that's been done, why people behave the way that they do, what feelings that they are harbouring under the surface, and how does that show itself. And I will be looking at it from the perspective of the person being researched, an individual. I will be looking at groups, which includes the online community, and I won't say the name of them, you will know who I mean, and why they do what they do and why they post what they post, and the infrastructure that we are all very certain is behind it. I look at a dysfunctional family. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. There's another category as well, but I think those 3 in particular will be of interest. Groups, dysfunctional family, individuals. Oh, and media will be in the dysfunctional groups as well as groups. They kind of straddle both. Hopefully that's generated some interest in that as well. I'm already having fun with that, putting that together. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to the responses. So, speak to you all in the comments, and I will speak to you again next Sunday. Bye for now. Bye from Ivy. Bye.